Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Jenna Hamid. I'm the Programs Manager at Center for Book Arts. Thank you so much for joining us for this final installment of a multi-part series of public programs in conjunction with the Center for Book Arts' current exhibition, Interspecies Futures. Curated by Oscar Salguero, the exhibition is the first survey of bookworks by leading international practitioners from the contemporary fields of bioart and speculative design who have turned to the book as a tool for the proposal of alternative human to non-human scenarios. Today, we'll hear from Oscar and Richard Pell, who will discuss his enigmatic publication, Theory of Mermaid De-Extinction, which was published in 2021, and it makes its debut at the exhibition. Oscar Salguero will also present important moments of history of the interspecies-related books and will discuss what the future of an interspecies library might look like. Oscar is a researcher, critical designer, and independent book curator based in Brooklyn, where he runs the Anti-Library, a project that identifies unconventional trends and predicts future attitudes via the study of independent artist books. This program would not be possible without the support of the New York State Council on the Arts, with the support of Andrew Cuomo and the New York State Legislature, and by public funds in New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, and by an award from the National Endowment for the Arts. We'd also like to acknowledge the support of our vibrant community. Donations are not expected or necessary, but are certainly appreciated. So with that being said, I'll turn it over to Oscar.
Thank you, Jenna. And thank you once again to the Center for Book Arts for this incredible opportunity to present this research and this whole exhibition, collection, in fact. So today I would like to start by talking a little bit about this concept of interspecies futures and what kind of library it may become in the future. And then I'll leave it open to Rich Pell to present his incredible project, Theory of Mermaid De-Extinction. So let me share the screen now. So let me know if you guys can see. That's good. Excellent. So I would like to start this quick presentation by talking about like some moments in printed matter history that relates to the idea of having interactions with other species, whether that means like from a fantastical point of view or from a science-based perspective. So I identify a few phases that I am presenting here. The first one is like I call the proto era. So it is the phase 0 and starts with this book, Micrographia 1665 by Robert Hooke. So this is an incredible moment in printed history because it presents for the first time a magnified illustrations of insects and parts of plants and just like the things that he was observing with a proto microscope that he created. So this moment in page 210, there is a fold out and people for the first time opened this and they went, you know, all scientists went crazy because for the first time they saw such a tiny creature in a gigantic scale. So to me, this fold out moment represents an immersion into a non-human sort of scale. And then after this phase, quite early, I identify a phase that I call speculative evolution, which in fact starts with the origin of species, on the origin of species by Charles Darwin in 1859. A lot of people are not aware that there is a paragraph in the book where he speculates about future type of bear, and it was so controversial that he decided to omit this section on the second edition. So it says, in North America, the black bear was seen swimming for hours with widely open mouth, thus catching like a whale insects in the water. I can see no difficulty in a race of bears being rendered by natural selection more and more aquatic in their structure and habits, with larger and larger mouths, till a creature was produced as monstrous as a whale. So right here, I believe is the origin of speculative evolution. Even though he sort of rejected this, his mind was going there. So after that, there is this fascinating document called The Snouters, Form and Life of the Rhinogrades, 1957. Completely made up selection of species from an island in the Pacific Ocean by a professor, Dr. Harold Stumke, who turns out to be a hoax. The entire document is a hoax, and is a fictional scientist. But it tells you about the documentation of these species that actually like sort of walk on their nose on this like appendage. And at the moment, a lot of people thought it was real. Some people thought it was a hoax. So this introduces something called like scholarship hoax or bio hoax already in the 50s. In fact, there is a photographer that years later, Joan Fontcuberta from Spain, creates a sort of a similar take on that called fauna, or some people call it fauna secreta, like secret fauna, where there's also a German scientist is presenting all this documentation of these fantastical species, but from in a scientific method kind of way. One of the most significant moments in the history of this sort of like in speculation and animals comes with the publication of After Man, A Zoology of the Future by Dougal Dixon in 1981. This moment, as you can see in this page, is an incredible document where he presents around like 120 different species from a world where humans no longer exist. So it's presenting sort of a natural field guide with where, you know, what kind of like environments they live in on Earth post-human, and how they evolve, and what kind of new traits they developed. So a lot of people consider this book the origin of sort of a more modern speculative zoology movement. Years later, he continued with a book called I'm forgetting right now. It's about the dinosaurs, the New Dinosaurs. There you go, New Dinosaurs, 1988. Also, what would have happened if dinosaurs never went extinct? And this one, which is called The Future is Wild, from 2002, where he imagines another set of species. So I'll let you know that I had the pleasure to also have Dougal Dixon in this show with a book called Green World. And there's also an essay and an interview with him on the catalog. Phase 2, which I call non-human consciousness and communication. So to me, sort of starts like the modern era of that starts with this book, The Mind of the Dolphin and Non-Human Intelligence by John C. Lilly, who's a very experimental sort of scientist who, you know, even gave LSD, ketamine to dolphins and tried to communicate with them. It's extremely, you know, provocative what he was doing and controversial, but he was attempting something that maybe had never been done in the scientific world in this way, which is what does it mean to communicate with other species? This later was even considered as a way to communicate with extraterrestrial intelligences. And this became the Order of the Dolphin, which was a group between Carl Sagan, John C. Lilly, and other scientists were trying to find intelligences out there. There's even Echo the Dolphin is a video game from Sega that's actually inspired by this concept of John C. Lilly and dolphin communication. This is from the 90s. Then there's even the book Mushroom Book from 1972 by John Cage, who started the Mycological Society in New York. So there is actually, this is from 72, where he's experimenting with this foraging of this species, and collaborates with a painter and a scientist. And just to show you that there is a renewed interest in this kind of documentations, Atelier Edition from Canada just published in 2020 a newer version of this called John Cage, a Mycological Foray. And third phase is bioart, or genetic alteration, which to me even kind of starts like, there's hints of that in science fiction, like Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton in 1991, where he's bringing this idea of resurrection biology and de-extinct species. Then the work of Eduardo Katz in the late 90s, and this fascinating book that he created called "It's Not Easy Being Green," in cataloging all the responses of community, in response to a project, GFP Bunny, where he makes a bunny glow green under UV light via a specific gene alteration. And one that we include in the show, which is Fungal Genetics and Biology, is a scientific journal. This is volume 89 from 2016, which presents for the first time in this kind of serious scientific journal presentations. Like in the cover presents the work by Alexander Daisy Ginsberg, who is a leading synthetic biology biodesigner. So this is a quite interesting moment where speculation meets science. The fourth phase I call Interspecies Futures, and this is sort of like the origin of this entire collection of presentation, where it's very much inspired by on both extremes, from science fiction by authors like Ursula K. Le Guin and books such as The Wonderful World is Forest, Octavia Butler. There's a lot of interesting, like the relationships between humans and this sort of fictional species, and then the ethical bonds that derive from that. But also on the theoretical side, from authors like Donna J. Haraway and her most recent book, Staying with the Trouble, Making King in the Tulucine. So here you have like a whole wave of new artists who are equally inspired by sci-fi, but also speculative fabulation or post-humanities in response to advances in biotechnology and climate change and the future of our relationship with species in the 21st century. So this is the book that we've created here in this presentation, the catalog called Interspecies Futures, published in 2021. And here's an image of the show, for those of you who haven't seen it yet. Presenting books starting all of them from the last 5 years. On the large table on the right, books from 2017 to 2019. Books I have been identifying personally and collecting. And on the left side, books that I commissioned for the show. So 6 books, one of them being the book that we're going to hear about today. From the sympathetic to the dystopian, from the symbiotic to the alienating, Interspecies Futures presents bookworks that reflect new attitudes toward the non-human. Through the artist's vision, field guides, lost diaries, investigative dossier, lab journals, and corporate catalogs become documents or portals into multiple interspecies possibilities. Aside of on the side of the presentation, on the main gallery, we have a wall where I'm presenting the Interspecies Library. So this is the debut of this new sort of archive where I intend to preserve and curate these documents for the future, for the next generations. And an interesting exercise that I asked some of the participants in the show what they imagine an Interspecies Library might look like. So we have here the response from Thomas Thwaites, the author of Goatman. An interspecies library is written entirely in the first person, present tense. You wouldn't read a work in it. You'd have to experience it. It would be a library of simulations or participatory theater or obstacle courses or environments or habitats. Each shelf would be a corridor and each book a door, and behind each door would be a book written in direct physical sensations. Obviously, each species would get something different from each book. The physical sensation of sunlight or the smell of a cave would mean different things for a bat than for a tree. But perhaps this is okay. A text means different things for each of its readers, if only slightly. And the response of Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg, editor of Synthetic Aesthetics: a library not organized by decimals or linear thinking, metaphor placed next to fungi, and so on. In fact, this is how my father's bookshelf is organized. I've always been intrigued to know whether it is accidental, but I had never asked because it's more fun not to know. Now I'm going to present you just an overview of some of the projects that some of the books that I consider part of this Interspecies Futures phase. Aurelia Immortal from 2017 by Javier Viver. Here we have Non-Flowers, which is another book commissioned to the show. This is by Thomas Poss, who is based in Iceland. The presentation of synthetic flowers for pollinators. Nimia Vivier by Jenna Sutella from 2019. A rover machine communicating with bacterial that is able to survive in Mars. Hotel Symbiogenesis 2021 by Hypothetical Studios and Design Matter from Korea. Tiger Penis Projects from 2018 by Kwang Yiku, who offers the replacement of the killing of exotic animals and for their organs, and in exchange to create these on a laboratory. Signal Crayfish 2021, also a commissioned book for the show by Christopher Urim. And finally, this one is the one that we're going to highlight today, Theory of Mermaid De-Extinction 2021 by Richard Pell. So Richard Pell works at the intersection of science, engineering, and culture. He's worked in a variety of electronic media, from documentary, video, to robotics, to bioart, to museum exhibition. He's the founder and director of the Center for PostNatural History, an organization dedicated to the collection and exposition of life forms that have been intentionally and heritably altered through domestication, selective breeding, tissue culture, or genetic engineering. I'm super excited today to present to you his work, and I will now let you hear it directly from him.
All right, Oscar, thank you so much. One moment. All right, thank you, Oscar, for inviting me into this, and Jenna for making today's event possible, and to the Center for Book Arts for hosting all this. So my name is Rich Pell, and I am the director, founder of a small museum based in Pittsburgh called the Center for PostNatural History. And we're basically dedicated to exhibiting and collecting living things that have been altered by people intentionally. So through domestication, selective breeding, genetic engineering. And these all tend to be living things that don't end up in natural history museums, hence the name post-natural history. They're living things that kind of reveal something about us, though. It's kind of the cultural footprint in nature. And it's kind of a missing piece in natural history. A lot of museums are kind of scrambling now to like talk about the Anthropocene. But for the last 200 years or so, they've been kind of ignoring it. They've been trying to keep the nature and the culture separate, like the culture is somehow contaminating the nature. This wasn't always the case, though. If we kind of rewind all the way back to the earliest museum in America, anyway, we end up here. This is Charles Wilson Peele's American Museum about 200 years ago. It's also probably among the first museums in the world to have the idea of the public as like its primary audience, right? It's not just for the wealthy, it's not just for the super educated. And in his museum, he had wild plants and animals right alongside domesticated ones, as well as kind of emerging science and new technologies. And then also, he kind of held a place for the unknown, kind of right in the middle of the museum. So if you look under that like red curtain there, you see these kind of skeletal legs. And this was his kind of main featured attraction. He called it the great incognito, the great unknown. This was the first mastodon skeleton, first complete mastodon skeleton to be unearthed here in North America. And you can't really overstate how mind-blowing this was. Something of that scale, kind of unprecedented. Especially when kind of, European thought leaders had been telling everyone that, everything you find over in North America is like lesser versions of stuff we have here in Europe, right? That was kind of like the belief at the time. So this was huge, and it occupied a huge space right in the middle of the museum for the unknown, for the stuff, for something that we didn't know exactly what it was yet. And I'm really interested in how science holds a space for the unknown, for the things that it doesn't exactly know how to describe yet, that it hasn't perfectly quantified yet. So here are a couple of maps. The one on the right is the more recent one, that's 1842. The one on the left, 1689. These are both of the southern pole of the Earth. You can see kind of the southern tip of South America there. And I mean, they're both missing kind of an essential piece here. The continent of Antarctica is not yet present. That wasn't circumnavigated or mapped out anyway for a few decades after the one on the right. But they're both kind of representing this like space of unknowing. And they're representing it with like a high degree of precision. All these longitudinal lines converging. They seem rather confident in the absence. That's probably overstating it, but this is somehow science being confronted with what it doesn't know, and this is the choice that it's making in this particular case. So if we rewind a little bit further, here's a map from 1570. And again, we're looking at South America. You can kind of follow, the shape is a little bit wonky, right? But you can follow to the bottom there, and lo and behold, there's this huge continent right there, kind of where Antarctica ought to be, called Terra Australis. And it was it's present on a lot of old maps. With a high degree of precision, right? There's some rivers there, some features labeled. And this is a continent that had been sort of expected to exist, going all the way back to Ptolemy. So like 2nd century AD, there was this idea that like the Earth needed to have a continent down there or it would be kind of top heavy. And so it was always expected. And if we rewind back a little bit further than that, just a few years this time, 1562, right? We still got Patagonia there, southern tip of South America. We've got a little bit of this imaginary continent, Terra Australis. And then over in the water there, we've got some creatures swimming around. One of them looks kind of monstrous. And there's 2 definite mermaids there, right? And what are they doing there? They're kind of signifying the unknown in a lot of ways. They're signifying danger. But they correspond also to firsthand accounts of the time, reports from ships that came back that had seen creatures that resemble something like the idea of a mermaid that people had been expecting to see for so long. So I guess my question to you is, which of these maps is more accurate? Which of them more honestly depicts the unknown? It's kind of an open question. So these mer people that are out there in the water, of various shapes and forms, have existed in many, if not most cultures worldwide, going back thousands of years. This kind of fish people is a character that kind of comes up again and again, even amongst desert cultures. And it's kind of a complicated following these paths, how they kind of influence one another, their associations with power at various times. The modern idea of a mermaid that we have is itself kind of a chimera of a bunch of different separate mythological origins coming together. You've got a little bit of like the Greek siren, which was not a fish person. It was like more of a bird person creature, but that had this amazing voice. And so we borrowed that. Now our mermaids have amazing voices. This fusion happened actually by the Catholic Church. It sort of took all these different threads together, wove them together to create this character that it could then use for its own purposes, which was largely as more of a general cautionary tale, cautions of sexual desire, of seduction, and the perilous drowning that would result if you gave in to those instincts. And this kind of fuels this idea of these mer people out there, that they are comfortable in precisely the places where we are the most out of our element, right? And that they inhabit kind of the outer edge of the map, where things are most dangerous, but perhaps there's the greatest sense of wonder out there. We're drawn to that edge of the map. And they signify the dangers that come along with the unknown. So in running a museum that's kind of like a natural history museum, I'm always looking for artifacts like that map that kind of signify the unknown, where science has kind of collected something, filed it away, that kind of harkens back to this lack of knowing. So right here, we've got, this is the bill of a duck-billed platypus that somewhere along the line in the 19th century, somebody forcibly tore off of a stuffed platypus, not a living one, in an effort to prove that it was fake. Now, why would anyone do that? Well, at the time, in the say early 19th century, duck-billed platypuses are arriving in Western Europe from the other side of the planet, right? This is the British Empire kind of bringing all of its best stuff that it's conquered and stolen and acquired along the way back to Great Britain. And in one of those ships is a duck-billed platypus. This is without precedent, like nothing like the duck-billed platypus was expected to be found, right? And it occupies this like hybrid kind of space between species. It's a little bit of duck, a little bit of mammal, a little bit of reptile. And people were not prepared for it. Here's an ad for a museum exhibition during the 19th century. We've got a bunch of mummies from various places, of course. And then you've got the duck-billed platypus right there in the middle, followed quickly by the half fish, half human mermaid. All right, well, in hindsight, we know these mummies exist. They're real things, people. The duck-billed platypus, totally real. And what is the mermaid doing there? They were both kind of happening at the same time. Mermaids as an idea had been trending for centuries. The more people kind of were able to go out into the ocean from Western Europe, the more sort of conflicting reports were coming back and all being kind of stitched together, fitting together with like an ongoing mythological idea of what they might be. And at the same time, science is starting to happen, like in the sense that we want kind of repeatable results. And we want to make sure that what you're seeing is what I'm seeing. And things are being recorded with a kind of perspectival accuracy to a greater degree than ever before. And mermaids were a part of that. Mermaids entered the gaze of science. The Royal Society starts publishing illustrations of mermaid finds and bones that are being attributed to mer people. Gentleman's Magazine published what was at the time believed to be the most accurate depiction of what a mermaid would look like. And it was done by one of the most famous illustrators of its time. Benjamin Franklin published mermaid sightings in his magazine, and he was very tapped into what was acceptable, respected scientific community of the day. This is all to say that this isn't kind of fantastical fringe stuff. This is like mainstream. Carl Linnaeus, the person who gave us the idea of naming things with two names, a genus and a species. He assigned a genus and species to mermaids and lobbied heavily to the Royal Society to send out an expedition to once and for all confirm the presence of these creatures that we've been hearing so much about for so long. All right, enter the mermaid specimen, the actual physical thing, kind of like that duck-billed platypus. And they're arriving in Europe and into Great Britain at the same time, sometimes on the same ships. This is the most famous of them. This was Captain Edis's mermaid. We're talking 1822. And he's exhibiting this in coffee shops in London, causing quite a stir. This particular mermaid was illustrated many times. And so we have a pretty good sense of what it looks like. And there was an open conversation amongst scientists and natural historians of the day. Was this confirmation of this thing that had been trending for so long? It didn't look exactly like what people were expecting, especially not like the kind of femme fatale of the sea version of what a mermaid is supposed to look like. But then that's what science does, right? It's always giving us something that is a little bit less wondrous than what we were expecting. That is somehow indicative of truth, might have like elevated the credulity, right, of this kind of desiccated, dried mermaid creature. Eventually, William Clift was allowed access to it and took very thorough notes of what he saw, and he attempted to debunk it, right, to say that he found the stitching, right? This is actually the upper half of some kind of primate, perhaps a juvenile orangutan, stitched to the lower half of a large sea fish, perhaps a salmon of some kind. Case closed, right? But that's kind of just the beginning. These mermaid specimens begin to travel and just go from city to city, attracting more and more attention as they go. And they also kind of proliferate in a weird way. There's more of them. Mermaids are begetting mermaids, and they've kind of gone from that upright one that we were seeing in the other illustrations to this style, which we call like the crawling mermaids. And quite a lot of these to this day exist in the collections of natural history museums, right? Again, why? Harvard Peabody has one. The Wellcome Collection and the British Museum have several. In fact, Henry Wellcome really went out of his way to collect these mermaid specimens. And I think that question is really interesting, is why. I think there's something there. There's something there about science, when science like sees the thing that it wants to be true, right? Everyone wanted, who doesn't want a mermaid to be real, right? Scientists included. And it serves as this kind of reminder of what we really want. We want something to be out there at the outer edge of the map. We don't want to get to the edge and find that there's just nothing there. Science is kind of drawn in a very human way by the desires that make us people, right? Not by this kind of abstracted, super rationalist, mechanistic kind of way. So this mermaid, Captain Edis's, that same upright one from before, eventually lands in the hands of one P.T. Barnum, who brings it to New York City in 1842 and creates what is arguably the first blockbuster museum exhibit. Again, this is decades after it was quote unquote debunked. It's now has a bigger audience than anyone could possibly imagine. And he's showing this in New York City at the American Museum, and he creates a viral campaign that's truly remarkable, and using articles published in newspapers all over the place to get people to come out to it, lined up around the block. And then his museum burns to the ground, not once, but twice. And there's no sign of that mermaid ever again, presumably lost in those fires. So when thinking about what mermaids are with respect to science, what does it mean for science to see a mermaid, for a mermaid sighting to be taken seriously? I think of these as false positives, right? The mermaid was like kind of a confirmation of something a result that was desired, but was perhaps inaccurate. And so these false positives, I would argue, are more likely to take place when the human capacity to act on the world or to access the world has outpaced our understanding of it. They're inherently are occupying the unknown still, just maybe not at the outer edge of the map of the ocean, but maybe in any domain where the unknown is present. So here we go. This is Percival Lowell, one of the most prominent astronomers of the early part of the 20th century. He's spending a lot of time staring through a telescope at Mars and making very detailed drawings of what he sees. And what he's seeing is spots, little structures of some kind on Mars that he sees being connected by straight lines. And he sees that as evidence of some kind of artificial construction. He's hypothesizing canals, that this is a planet that has lost most of its water. Water is a precious resource. And so it's kind of holding together its civilizations via these engineered canalways. And he's making really detailed maps of this, right? And he's not hallucinating. He's a respected scientist of his time. And yet, as we get a better look at Mars, those ideas kind of fade away. And it is presumed that, I suppose in a sense, he was hallucinating, right? Like that there's an optical illusion that happens when you're right at the edge of what your vision can figure out. And we kind of draw kind of lines between things. But he was succumbing to, essentially his own hypothesis. He was in love with it. And I think that's something that most scientists, if they're honest, can relate to. That a false positive reveals something about what we want. It reveals that unstated assumption that science isn't supposed to have. So flash forward to the 1970s. Here's like a computer printout. This is from a radio astronomy radio telescope run by Ohio State University. And so it's listening to space. And so for some reason, this result here was outlandishly out of step with what we would expect to be coming from the noise, the randomness of deep space. So much so that the scientist writes, "Wow," right there, circles it in red ink. For a moment, this was, maybe proof positive of there being intelligent life out there. Once again, these are mermaid sightings. They're just not happening in the ocean. But I think the instincts are fundamentally the same. False positives provide a peek into those unfiltered desires of the person who mistook them for evidence to begin with. And this happens all over the place. In the late 90s, this photograph was kind of all over the news. This is a kind of a scanning electron microscopy photo of some Martian meteorite. And that thing in the middle there was hypothesized to be fossilized bacteria, right? Actual tangible proof of there being life on another planet. All of these subsequently there's other explanations that have kind of overtaken those original assumptions. They're not seen as the evidence that they once were. But I think, to me, these are beautiful. They aren't a source of embarrassment, or shouldn't be. They're a reminder of the humanity within this mechanism that we pretend is supposed to be non-subjective, right? Completely objective, completely rational, which is baloney, right? This is evidence of what it is that we want. And ultimately, it seems like in these cases anyway, as a species, as a planet, we don't want to be alone, right? The container has gone from being land masses surrounded by oceans to being a planet surrounded by space. And we still want there to be something else out there at the edge. So I was really excited about this idea, and I wanted to talk to scientists about it. So I started going to conferences and presenting poster sessions about this idea, and just trying to have kind of an open conversation about how the unknown is represented in science, kind of what we can learn from like looking at mermaids as this kind of metaphor for the way science is confronted by the unknown. I took this out to a conference hosted by Google called Sci-Fu, which is a really weird conference. There's like no particular topic. They just bring together a few hundred people, and you kind of create your own agenda, which is great for me. So I was able to give essentially a version of the talk that I just gave you out there. A short time later, I get this email. I also don't speak Greek, but I did recognize that that word there, anthomoesa, however that's pronounced, I don't know, but I recognize that as from looking at mermaid myths. This is an island that is supposedly inhabited by mermaids. And so I kind of copy pasted the line into a translate engine, and it said something like this link will only work once. Okay, and it's like, it's a pretty ugly looking link. It's not the kind of link that I typically would click on or encourage anyone else to. But I thought it was interesting enough, that weird kind of mermaid reference, that I took an old laptop that I didn't care about and clicked on this link to find out where it goes. And it was an attachment, ended up being a text file, just filled with ATGs and Cs. The letters of DNA, just a whole lot of it. And I thought, this is interesting. And I have friends who are biologists. So, it's like, what do you think this is? How could we learn anything about this? Is there anything to be learned? And they're like, well, right away, it's not big enough. I was like, okay, well, that was kind of disappointing. Like a genome of a plant or an animal is going to be, millions, tens of millions of letters long. And this was like thousands. And it's even like too small to be like even a single chromosome. But it was like a few thousand letters, which is enough to be, it's not even like a small bacteria, but there is in your cells, or in our cells, there's a thing called a mitochondria, which has its own little tiny piece of DNA. And that was what it looked like. It looked like, this is like mitochondrial DNA. This is sort of common to all plants and animals. We all have that in our cells. And it has like just a few genes that are very well conserved. One of them in particular is a gene that biologists use for like I think they call it DNA barcoding, for like identifying what species something is. Like if you don't know anything else about it, you can look at that gene, and then there's like ways that you can search and figure out what species that little piece of DNA is, right? So they helped me use this tool. It's called BLAST, and it gives you like a result of like the thing that is a closest match within their database. And this is what I got back. Those top two have this like 50% coverage, and there's like Salmo salar is one species, and then the other one was Pongo pygmaeus, and then there was a few others in like the Salmo and Pongo genuses. And so I, pop those into Google, right? What do these things look like? So it turns out that that genus, that Oncorhynchus was another one in the result there. I guess that's the one I found a picture for. Is a big fish. And Pongo is a big primate. That's an orangutan. So this is a curious thing. So I replied, and I said, "Thank you for the weird DNA. It must have been strange growing up with a fish and ape for parents. I'd be very interested in receiving more if there is any. Thank you." And I kind of wasn't expecting to hear anything back. But I got a reply that had another attachment, this time way larger, about 6 gigs of file attachments to it, that all contained nothing but ATs, Gs, and Cs, just a tons of DNA, and like one little note that just said, "Please take care of her." It's like, okay, this is pretty weird. So a short time later, doorbell rings. I'm here at the museum, and there's a private delivery company dropping off a package, which is not unusual. I have like a lot of exhibits that go off and they travel and they come back. And oftentimes I have very little notice, and it's just always like a person in a van. So I signed for it, open the box up, and this is what's looking at me, which is uglier in person, I assure you. I'm like, this is a really weird thing to get in the mail. And there was, no return address, just this. At the base of it, there's a little bronze plaque, or brass, I guess, presented by President and Mrs. Ferdinand E. Marcos, Republic of the Philippines. I'm old enough for those names kind of registered, but I wasn't exactly sure, so I did a little bit of Googling, right? The Marcos family were the dictators that ruled the Philippines from the 60s into the 80s, and were at that time, one of, if not the wealthiest couple in the world. And they got that wealth just by taxing everybody and not, then just pocketing the money. So Imelda was famous for like her shoe collection. For whatever reason, that was the thing that people remember her for in the West anyway. And would go on these like lavish shopping trips all over the world. So that's whatever that is. That's an unexpected connection here. It's worth considering how much this resembles those illustrations of Captain Edis's mermaid from way back when. There's no indication of like fire damage or smoke or anything on this one, as far as I could tell, that might connect it back to Barnum's Museum or something like that. But it is the only mermaid I've seen in specimen form that looks like those drawings. So on the base of the thing, there's like a little note that I tore off, and it says, "She was given to me by a retired intelligence officer who worked for the Pentagon. He had acquired her in the mid-1980s when the vice president's residence needed to remove any associations with the Marcos family following the overthrow of their dictatorship. It was apparently a gift primarily from Imelda Marcos to Barbara Bush. She's in good condition, but for the biopsy sample I took from her tail fin to identify her species genetically. Please give her a good home." And sure enough, a closer examination of that tail fin revealed this is apparently where this person took this little biopsy. So this is all a very strange experience to have 6 gigs of alleged mermaid DNA and a weird dried mermaid body to boot. I'm inviting people, whatever your expertise is, to participate in an analysis of what I'm calling the Marcos mermaid. Every mermaid has to have a name, and this one just kind of, it just works. There'll be an exhibition at the MIT Museum in about a year. And so we've got plenty of lead time to try to bring together expertise from a lot of different realms and try to sort out what's going on with this mermaid situation. So that's where the talk part ends. I do want to thank Oscar and Jenna and the Center for Book Arts, and I would like to give a shout out to the historian Dr. Vaughn Scribner, whose book came out this year, Merpeople: A Human History, that was really helpful for me in understanding that earlier relationship between the church and mermaids. And that's where I will end it. Oscar, you there?
Thank you, Rich. That was awesome.
Oh, thank you.
So also to let you guys know, like we have never met in person.
This is true.
Yeah, we've only seen each other through screen. And it was also incredible when I heard about this project through another exhibition where you presented about art and genetics, right? So I saw it in the catalog, and I was just quite intrigued because I remember that when I opened the spread that talked about this project, you had made a fake Photoshop of like a book with a DNA sequence on it. And to me, it was like, at that moment, I'm like, this person is very interested in artifacts, and artifacts that represent scientific inquiries or moments of investigation. And he's using, I guess, like fiction, right? You're using fiction, like some sort of methods. You have an understanding of how to use these methods to like blur the lines between the reality and the fiction. So that's when I decided like to contact you and then to propose the idea, could this become an actual book? And I remember we started talking about, exchanging like some conversations. And then you presented this idea of a dossier, right? You used sort of like from the 30s or something from your great grandfather. You want to explain that part?
Oh yeah, well, in terms of like the physical form of this stuff, this is the one that I have. I ended up making up two of them. But my great grandfather was an English professor. He's the only other academic in like the whole family tree. But he and my father is a lawyer. They both had a real affinity for office supplies, and somehow that became the thing that I would inherit. So I these two small, lovely little leather-bound binders have just been sitting there, and I didn't know what to use them for, because I don't have a real affinity for office supplies, truth be known. But it seemed like this was about the right size for trying to bring together these ideas, these kind of like artifacts that I'm still struggling to make sense out of, and that this could be an opportunity to again invite people into considering it, that you could gather around and just try to wrap your head around it. And it's different enough from what we do at the Center for PostNatural History, which is a little bit more, we tend to not deal with the unknown so much. We're like really trying to talk about kind of brass tacks. This is what's happening in this lab or this farm and why. This needed a different approach. So when you invited me in, this just seemed like the ideal opportunity to try to just kind of put this stuff out in the public in that way.
Yeah, and what do you think now that you created that document? What are kind of like ideas you got after you finished it? After you saw this investigation, this research presented as a book, which is a book that to me, it can now live in someone's bookshelf, right? It can get lost. It can get lost in time, and it just represent a very atemporal, or like we don't know. Like if I don't have a background on this book and I just happen to encounter it somewhere, you've created a moment also of maybe a false positive moment as well, right?
Possibly, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, it is the, setting it free, setting it loose in the wild world, where it will be interpreted differently by different people. I think that was something I was pretty nervous about doing. Probably still am. I should be, right? But it also seemed kind of a necessary step, especially with I'm going to be exhibiting it, like I mentioned earlier, at the MIT Museum, amongst the company of some pretty substantial artifacts of genetic history, the machines that sequence the human genome. They're going to be neighbors to the Mermaid De-Extinction project. So it became something that I needed to be having more conversations with. And what I found is that every time I do, it's the person's background completely shifts what the conversation is about, right? The whole notion of the conversation is like just fundamentally different.
I wonder, even is there a community out there of like people really obsessed with this topic, mermaid, or is there? Yeah, I have no idea.
There are, and I haven't had any interaction with them yet, but there are mermaid fanatics out there, in a lot of different ways. There's a very kind of like gendered mermaid, right? And that has a certain kind of hetero kind of fantasy space around it. But there's also, the TV channel Animal Planet. The most successful program they ever ran was a pseudo documentary, like a mockumentary, about mermaids. And it was so successful, they made a second one. And so around those has become this whole new kind of speculative audience around mermaids. And it was I don't know, I wouldn't call it convincing, but maybe that's just because I'm a filmmaker and I'm like such a skeptic at heart. But I know quite a lot of people saw in passing that documentary on Animal Planet and are now believers. So I'm entering into that space in between, which is, again, that's the space of the unknown. It's the same space that the natural historians that were confronted with those earlier specimens in the 19th century were trying to make sense of things. And that's just a space that I'm comfortable in. And in this project, I'm just inviting other people to like, let's as a group, let's be in that space together, because it's quite often a solitary experience. People don't want to speak out loud about things that they're so afraid or to be embarrassed by, right? To be a believer in a false positive is like, especially in science, is like a real shameful thing. And I kind of want to open up a space for that's okay. That it's you're allowed to like allow for something into your mind, into your heart, into your being that other people tell you you're supposed to filter out.
I very much agree with that spirit. In fact, a lot of the books in the presentation in the Interspecies Futures show have this same sort of attitude, this sort of spirit of like the moment they're presented as a book, they adopt a new kind of nature, right? Because the book, to most people, when something is presented as a book, it has a certain weight, a certain like position or authority, like the project, the Tiger Penis project, where they're talking about the creation of synthetic animal organs created in a laboratory, where once you see it in a book, you may think, okay, why not? And I think that's to me, intuitively, that was another interesting way that your project could be presented. Because I remember we even talk about, your project can be as simple as a USB, right? With 6 gigabytes of like the
right. I was just going to give you just the genome, just the data. Mm-hmm.
So it's so fascinating to know how many like different formats this can adopt. I know you have one where it's like a water tank with like a screen, right? LCD screen.
Yeah, yeah. There was one of the first times really that I was trying to exhibit this project. I wanted to exhibit 6 gigs of DNA, and I was like, how do I do that, right? It's like, I could pin a thumb drive to the wall and say that's what's in it, but I wanted something more interesting. So I took a glass vessel and had a computer with a screen inside it. It's underwater. It was not water, but it was something like, it looked like water. And it was just kind of scrolling through all the DNA. So I kind of created a habitat for it. Put it kind of in mermaid space a little bit rather than in purely science space.
We have a couple of questions. So Eddie says, are there security concerns about showing the Marcos Mermaid at MIT? The theft of specimens is increasing in Europe, so I'm interested about the exhibition design, etc. How would you show this rare material?
That's a great question, and that's I'm not designing the housing for it, so that's a question, a concern I need to be having with the people who are, because you're absolutely right. As somebody who has a museum collection and I visit others, I am very aware of the amount of theft that is going on right now in terms of theft of specimens. I mean, you might have heard of like rhino horn, that because of it's like a aphrodisiac in Chinese medicine, I think, and people will go in and just hack the horn off of specimens in collections and break the glass, but lots of others. I was visiting a taxidermy rental shop, and like the next day after I was there, they were just completely looted. So yeah, thank you for the reminder. Security, that's a concern.
Yeah. There's another question by Steph. It says, thank you for the great talk. What are the ways of holding unknowns, in your opinion or experience?
Boy, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, that is the question. I think, I don't know that I have like specific ways or methods. There's like, I gave some examples of ones that I'd seen, right? The map that nonetheless is missing, missing an essential piece. The artifacts that are kind of kept around, right? That duck-billed platypus could have easily been thrown away, right? But somebody kept it around. And I think that's a really important thing to do. Especially science museums, natural history museums. Science is always changing. We're always like learning new stuff, and then are immediately embarrassed by the old way of thinking. And I would love it that if instead of just kind of continuously erasing its own history and updating it, if we just like kind of wheel those exhibits off to like maybe another hall of the museum, we'll call it the Hall of Incognitums. And that's where you get to go in there and see all the things that used to be believed that are, presented just as confidently as they were at the time. I think that would be super powerful. But I haven't gotten any museum to take me up on that idea yet.
Yes. I also have a question. I find it interesting as well that you're using, at the end of the book, there's an index with some documents, sort of like facsimile, I guess, or of earlier historical documents when mermaid is mentioned, Carl Linnaeus essay or writings on the mermaid, and you have an ontology, a timeline of mermaid history, I guess, like side.
Yeah.
That to me is also quite interesting because even there is a history of documentation, like where you say Benjamin Franklin had an article on that published. There's a history of like also leaving a trace of these documents, printed matter. Receiving an email, right? Whereas that email is going to get lost somehow. Your server is going to get full, who knows? But now there is a trace, there's a printed trace to that.
Yeah.
That will be preserved somehow. Yes. how do you have any feelings at the end of like making the book? Any feelings about the future of that document that you created?
Well, what a great question. I mean, here's what we were talking about, by the way. Is in the back of the book, there's sort of pockets with, in some cases, additional books. These are facsimiles of. This is a dissertation that Carl Linnaeus and one of his doctoral students published on sirens, and there's a facsimile of this description of the mermaid that was published by Captain Edis. And in other places, I have ones from various journals of medicine that published mermaid sightings. And I'm always interested in primarily, when science is seeing them. That's kind of what this project is mostly about. But you're right; these things are so ephemeral. That pamphlet, I think there's only one that still exists of the original run. Right. So somebody kept that around in the British Library. Somebody scanned it, made a PDF. I was able to recreate it and make 20 copies or whatever. And like you say, the emails, like how many emails get kept around for more than a few years. So bringing them all together and giving them tangible physical form does seem like the best way, I guess, to keep something around. I'm a believer in physicality. Despite the dangers of fires and archives burning to the ground, I think getting something out of the digital space into the physical one is a best path for survival.
I agree. There's a question from Michelle. How long did you sit on clicking the link and opening the attachment from the email? Or was it so intriguing that you dove right into it?
I think that was a matter, you probably measured in minutes. They felt long, but yeah, it was just a matter of like, how can I click on it safely? And I realized like, oh, I've got a computer I don't care about. That's what, that's what those are for.
I also want to comment on the fact that I noticed that you also carry a lot of a mini library, right? And how important is it for the Center for PostNatural History to grow also this library or this archiving of documents?
For those same reasons, very important. The library was always an important part of the museum from the beginning. And it served a couple of different purposes. In one, it just serves to describe what is included in postnatural history. So you can just kind of scan across these books. We have our own category system, right? We don't do Dewey Decimal. So you can sort of see what kind of the major themes are. But it also places it as a part of this ongoing conversation that's been happening since the beginning of civilization, right? Post-natural history, the way we talk about it, starts with domestication of dogs and then agriculture. So you're looking, 15,000 years back at least. It's not just about things that are happening in the lab today, though those are also included. And the library is just one way you can get a sense of that. We have books that are 200 years old. And then we have books that are brand new, addressing, I could point to one right now that's addressing, concerns about gain of function in genetically modified viruses, right? So they range from the historical anachronisms all the way through to like very present, urgent kind of moments, but not into the future. That's what we don't do. We are concerned with kind of the present moment and what is behind it.
Sort of a heritage, right? A heritage of these moments when they were questioning these topics and then just leave these traces, these studies. I also noticed that in your practice in the Center for Postnatural History, there's a lot of pamphlets, like sort of like simple publications, like almost like chapbooks, almost like smaller, maybe like kind of a accessible kind of printing methods that you're using. What can you tell us about those? And they seem to be a series, right?
Well, yeah, unofficially, I suppose. I would love to have them be in a series, but I love little books. Part of it is probably honestly a function of attention span. I have a terrible time finishing books, but little ones I can, and it makes me feel like I've completed them. So I've just always been interested in like kind of pocket-sized books, and there's a whole history of those. Like your ideas can only be so complicated when they're presented in that form. So we have, enough printing equipment and paper cutting equipment that we can make little books. It's a more affordable way to do it as well. And when I do them in house, I have, so I mentioned my great-grandfather earlier, Raymond Woodbury Pence. He was like, I mentioned he loves office supplies. He collected a ton of like stationery, like just like blank paper, which again, I inherited because nobody else wanted it. So a lot of our publications, get to have, the benefit of antique paper and this sort of thing as I kind of just chew through that inheritance that I have.
We have a question. By, yeah.
Oh, hi. Well, first of all, thanks a lot because the presentation was extremely inspiring. I just wanted to point to one sentence that you mentioned before. When I don't remember exactly what was on the slide, also because I was on the phone, but I think you were showcasing one of the first more realistic, let's say, visualizations of the mermaid that was kind of supposed to be a specimen, something like that. And you said, it's less attractive, or I don't remember if the term was attractive, but than what you would expect for a mermaid, but that also made it look more scientific. And I thought it was very, very inspiring, this idea of the perception of what is scientific, based on, I would say, two factors probably. One is the format, of course, being like recorded in an image or in a drawing or in any other form of documentation makes a huge difference. And then on the other side also, I guess, and forgive me for the expression, but on how it idealized, is the version of that unknown object or unknown creature, in the sense that the idealized version of the mermaid was much more prototypical, and then instead the specimen is much less. So I just wanted to ask you about this perception of the scientific, both in format and in form, if you want to elaborate a little bit more.
Absolutely. I mean, in some respect, this is, it's like the difference between wonder and curiosity, right? And the idea of a mermaid exists in this speculative space of wonder, and everybody gets to create their own idea of what that is. And then science comes along with its skepticism. It's driven by curiosity. It's got to pin it down, like you said. Just some part of it is just turning it into a 2D image, right? And enters into that is like the aesthetics of disappointment, which I feel like science is often offering us, in response to the largest questions that we have. The truth often feels like, really? That's it? And we maybe have become accustomed to that. And as much as I love science, you do have to kind of work with it to find the wonder in it. But the difference between what you want and what you get can often be really huge, and somehow science and truth often end up on the what you get side.
I mean, the aesthetic of disappointment is an amazing concept. And if you want, is a very, very great resource for those who do fiction. Like John von Couberta, for example, that was mentioned before, I think, with the aesthetic of disappointment of science.
I should then attribute that. I borrowed that phrase from Oran Katz and Ionette Zur. They're bioartists in Australia, and they often, as a way of fostering critical thought around biotechnology are exhibiting, the truth of it, like a tissue culture. They exhibit as this, actual living cells that are actually tiny, and they're not really living. They're kind of dried out and desiccated, and they're not what people thought they would be seeing when they were expecting to see the living tissue of an animal kept alive. They like the aesthetics of disappointment. They'll often present them in jewel boxes, just so you know that like there's an expectation here that is not quite being fulfilled, and that's where truth somehow inhabits that space.
Well, I think also aesthetical disappointment, or this concept is right now is presented with the idea of like sending rovers to Mars, right?
Mm.
We're trying, everyone is so excited that we're gonna find some bacteria. So to me, like, is this hypothetical Martian bacteria or microorganisms, are they the new mermaids, right? Are they is Mars the new ocean, the edge that we don't want to yet define or yet like settle on, I think, yeah, that's kind of how I see, everyone is so excited about what can happen there, but maybe it's just rocks, that's the aesthetic of the one, is just a bunch of rocks.
I mean, that is the difference between, our Mars rovers landed in, this ancient ocean, but if you're expecting ocean, you're going to get a lot of dried rocks. They're all kind of the same color. But, if you stare hard enough at those rocks and you think about it hard enough, you can kind of extract out this kind of wondrous place that has existed over time on scales that we can't imagine. So I love science, but it does seem like you have to work at it harder to get the same kind of sense of wonder out of it.
And what do you think? What are your thoughts on the fact that there's so much interesting, outer space, as opposed to maybe like deep ocean, where deep ocean might actually have some of these fantastical organisms,
I mean, the ocean is so huge. We have barely scratched the surface. There's so much to be done here that, yeah, why not? And increasingly we're hearing about, this old idea of the aquatic ape sort of coming back. There's kind of, every generation or so, somebody writes a theory about human evolution having had an aquatic moment somewhere in its past, and this is responsible for all kinds of traits about us. Well, right there, you're basically making the scientific case for mermaids, right? Maybe they're not fish people, but aquatic people. So it all kind of comes around again and again. It's like the missing Antarctica. We sort of dreamed it into existence before we actually found it.
Do you also have any future ideas for the book? I remember you mentioned maybe developing some booklets into something more accessible.
Yeah, I mean, I've made copies that I can make, here in the studio, like 10 at a time. But I would like for it to exist. I would like to find a publisher. If anyone in the audience is a book publisher, I would love to talk to you. It's kind of a real pain because it's like books inside of books, the way I did it. And it's like pretty hard to reproduce. But I would like it to exist in any form, physically.
And finally, someone mentions the deep, hot biosphere.
I imagine we're talking about the undersea vents, but maybe we're just talking about, it's a sweaty biosphere out there.
All right, so I think that's, we have we answered all the questions. Thank you so much, Rich. That was a very layered and fascinating subject.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, I am so surprised, and like in a good way, how you were able to consolidate it into a book with such a nice concept of the dossier.
Well, thanks for having faith in me that I could. I think when we started the conversation, I wasn't quite sure.
I think that was the case with a lot of the invited artists. There was just intuition that they, there is an appreciation for the book format and an openness to play with it. So for everyone else, thank you for joining this last event of the program. The show is still up until June 26th. I am personally going on Saturdays. So this Saturday and the next one, if anyone wants a private tour, I will be there. And you can also order already the catalog, which is another like manifestation of a book of all this project, of all this research. And it's looking incredible. And Rich, you'll get your copy soon.
Great, can't wait.